Hora Undecima, 1742 hours. A question of practical importance to forecasting is how much time elapses between an injection of new magma and an ensuing eruption. In many volcanoes, this time interval may be measured in weeks or months, but in others it seems to be much shorter, possibly days or hours. Volcanology, 2nd edition. At the Villa Hortensia, the great coastal residence on the northern outskirts of Misenum, they were preparing to put a slave to death. They were going to feed him to the eels. It was not an unknown practice in that part of Italy, where so many of the huge houses around the Bay of Neapolis had their own elaborate fish farms. The new owner of the Villa Hortensia, the millionaire Numerius Popitius Ampliatus, had first heard the story as a boy, of how the Augustan aristocrat Vettius Pollio would hurl clumsy servants into his eel pond as a punishment for breaking dishes. And he would often refer to it admiringly as the perfect illustration of what it was to have power and imagination and wit and a certain style. So when, many years later, Ampliatus, too, came to possess a fishery, just a few miles down the coast from Vettius Pollio's old place at Polycypon, and when one of his slaves also destroyed something of rare value, the precedent naturally came back into his mind. Ampliatus had been born a slave himself. This was how he thought an aristocrat ought to behave. The poor fellow was duly stripped to his loincloth, had his hands tied behind his back, and was marched down to the edge of the sea. A knife was run down both of his calves, to draw an attractive amount of blood, and he was also doused with vinegar, which was said to drive the eels mad. It was late afternoon, very hot. The eels had their own large pen, built well away from the other fish ponds to keep them segregated, reached by a narrow concrete gangway extending out into the bay. These eels were morays, notorious for their aggression, their bodies as long as a man's and as wide as a human trunk, with flat heads, wide snouts, and razor teeth. The villa's fishery was 150 years old, and nobody knew how many lurked in the labyrinth of tunnels and in the shady areas built into the bottom of the pond. Scores, certainly, probably hundreds. The more ancient eels were monsters, and several wore jewelry. One, which had a gold earring fitted to its pectoral fin, was said to have been a favorite of the Emperor Nero. The morays were a particular terror to this slave because Ampliatus savored the irony. It had long been his responsibility to feed them, and he was shouting and struggling before he was forced onto the gangway. He had seen the eels in action every morning when he threw in their meal of fish heads and chicken entrails. The way the surface of the water flickered, then roiled as they sensed the arrival of the blood, and the way they came darting out of their hiding places to fight over their food, tearing it to pieces. At the 11th hour, despite the sweltering heat, Ampliatus himself promenaded down from the villa to watch, attended by his teenaged son, Celsinus, together with his household steward, Scutarius, a few of his business clients, who had followed him from Pompeii and had been hanging around since dawn in the hope of dinner, and a crowd of about 100 of his other male slaves who he had decided would profit by witnessing the spectacle. His wife and daughter he had ordered to remain indoors. This was not a sight for women. A large chair was set up for him, with smaller ones for his guests. He did not even know the errant slave's name. He had come as part of a job lot with the fish ponds when Ampliatus had bought the villa for a cool 10 million earlier in the year. All manner of fish were kept at vast expense along the shoreline of the house. Sea bass, with their woolly white flesh, gray mullet, which required high walls around their pond to prevent them leaping to freedom, flatfish and parrotfish and giltheads, lampreys and congers and hake. But by far the most expensive of Ampliatus's aquatic creatures, he trembled to think how much he had paid for them, and he did not even much like fish, were the red mullet, the delicate and whiskered goatfish, notoriously difficult to keep, whose colors ran from pale pink to orange. And it was these that the slave had killed. Whether by malice or incompetence, Ampliatus did not know, nor care, but there they were, clustered together in death as they had been in life, a multi-hued carpet floating on the surface of the pond, discovered earlier that afternoon. A few had still been alive when Ampliatus was shown the scene, but they had died even as he watched, turning like leaves in the depths of the pool and rising to join the others. Poisoned, every one. They would have fetched 6,000 apiece at current market prices, one mullet being worth 5 times as much as the miserable slave who was supposed to look after them, and now they were fit only for the fire. Ampliatus had pronounced sentence immediately. "Throw him to the eels!" The slave was screaming as they dragged and prodded him toward the edge of the pool. It was not his fault, he was shouting. It was not the food. It was the water. They should fetch the Aquarius. The Aquarius. Ampliatus screwed up his eyes against the glare of the sea. It was hard to make out the shapes of the writhing slave and of the 2 others holding him, or of the 4th, who held a boat hook like a lance and was jabbing it into the doomed man's back. Mere stick figures, all of them, in the haze of the heat and the sparkling waves. He raised his arm in the manner of an emperor, his fist clenched, his thumb parallel with the ground. He felt godlike in his power, yet full of simple human curiosity. For a moment he waited, tasting the sensation, then abruptly he twisted his wrist and jammed his thumb upward. Let him have it. The piercing cries of the slave teetering on the side of the eel pond carried up from the seafront, across the terraces, over the swimming pool, and into the silent house where the women were hiding. Cornelia Ampliata had run to her bedroom, thrown herself down on the mattress, and pulled her pillow over her head, but there was no escaping the sound. Unlike her father, she knew the slave's name, Hipponax, a Greek, and also the name of his mother, Attia, who worked in the kitchens, and whose lamentations, once they started, were even more terrible than his. Unable to bear the screams for more than a few moments, she sprang up again and ran through the deserted villa to find the wailing woman, who had sunk against a column in the cloistered garden. Seeing Cornelia, Attia clutched at her young mistress's hem and began weeping at her slippered feet, repeating over and over that her son was innocent, that he had shouted to her as he was being carried away. It was the water. The water. There was something wrong with the water. Why would nobody listen to him? Cornelia stroked Attia's gray hair and tried to make such soothing noises as she could. There was little else that she could do. Useless to appeal to her father for clemency. She knew that. He listened to nobody, least of all to a woman, and least of all women to his daughter, from whom he expected an unquestioning obedience. An intervention from her would only make the death of the slave doubly certain. To Attia's pleas she could only reply that there was nothing she could do. At this, the old woman, in truth she was in her 40s, but Cornelia thought of slave years as being like dog years, and she appeared at least 60, suddenly broke away and roughly dried her eyes on her arm. "I must find help." Attia, said Cornelia gently. "Who will give it?" "He shouted for the Aquarius, didn't you hear him? I shall fetch the Aquarius." "And where is he?" "He may be at the aqueduct down the hill where the watermen work." She was on her feet now, trembling but determined, staring around wildly. Her eyes were red, her dress and hair disordered. She looked like a madwoman, and Cornelia saw at once that no one would pay her any attention. They would laugh at her, or drive her off with stones. "I'll come with you," she said, and as another terrible scream arose from the waterfront, Cornelia gathered up her skirts with one hand, grabbed the old woman's wrist with the other, and together they fled through the garden, past the empty porter's stool, out of the side door, and into the dazzling heat of the public road. The terminus of the Aqua Augusta was a vast underground reservoir, a few hundred paces south of the Villa Hortensia, hewn into the slope overlooking the port and known, for as long as anyone could remember, as the Piscina Mirabilis, the Pool of Wonders. Viewed from the outside, there was nothing particularly wonderful about her, and most of the citizens of Misenum passed her without a second glance. She appeared on the surface as a low, flat-roofed building of red brick, festooned with pale green ivy, a city block long and half a block wide, surrounded by shops and storerooms, bars and apartments, hidden away in the dusty back streets above the naval base. Only at night, when the noise of the traffic and the shouts of the tradesmen had fallen silent, was it possible to hear the low, subterranean thunder of falling water, and only if you went into the yard, unlocked the narrow wooden door, and descended a few steps into the piscina itself, was it possible to appreciate the reservoir's full glory. The vaulted roof was supported by 48 pillars, each more than 50 feet high, although most of their length was submerged by the waters of the reservoir, and the echo of the aqueduct hammering into the surface was enough to shake your bones. The engineer could stand here, listening and lost in thought, for hours. The percussion of the Augusta sounded in his ears not as a dull and continuous roar, but as the notes of a gigantic water organ, the music of civilization. There were air shafts in the piscina's roof, and in the afternoons, when the foaming spray leaped in the sunlight and rainbows danced between the pillars, or in the evenings, when he locked up for the night and the flame of his torch shone across the smooth black surface like gold splashed on ebony. In those moments, he felt himself to be not in a reservoir at all, but in a temple dedicated to the only God worth believing in. Attilius's first impulse on coming down from the hills and into the yard at the end of that afternoon was to check the level of the reservoir. It had become his obsession, but when he tried the door he found it was locked, and then he remembered that Corax was carrying the key on his belt. He was so tired that for once he thought no more about it. He could hear the distant rumble of the Augusta. She was running. That was all that counted. And later, when he came to analyze his actions, he decided he could not really reproach himself for any dereliction of duty. There was nothing he could have done. Events would have worked out differently for him personally, that was true, but that hardly mattered in the larger context of the crisis. So he turned away from the piscina and glanced around the deserted yard. The previous evening he had ordered that the space be tidied and swept while he was away, and he was pleased to see that this had been done. There was something reassuring to him about a well-ordered yard. The neat stacks of lead sheets, the amphorae of lime, the sacks of puteolanum, the ruddy lengths of terracotta pipe. These were the sights of his childhood. The smells, too, the sharpness of the lime, the dustiness of fired clay left out all day in the sun. He went into the stores, dropped his tools on the earth floor, and rotated his aching shoulder, then wiped his face on the sleeve of his tunic and re-entered the yard just as the others trooped in. They headed straight for the drinking fountain without bothering to acknowledge him, taking turns to gulp the water and splash their heads and bodies. Corax, then Musa, then Becco. The two slaves squatted patiently in the shade, waiting until the free men had finished. Attilius knew he had lost face during the course of the day, but still he could live with their hostility. He had lived with worse things. He shouted to Corax that the men could finish work for the day, and was rewarded with a mocking bow, then started to climb the narrow wooden staircase to his living quarters. The yard was a quadrangle. Its northern side was taken up by the wall of the Piscina Mirabilis. To the west and south were storerooms and the administrative offices of the aqueduct. To the east was the living accommodation, a barracks for the slaves on the ground floor and an apartment for the Aquarius above it. Corax and the other free men lived in the town with their families. Attilius, who had left his mother and sister behind in Rome, thought that in due course he would probably move them down to Misenum as well, and rent a house, which his mother could keep for him. But for the time he was being but for the time being he was sleeping in the cramped bachelor accommodation of his predecessor, Exomnius, whose few possessions he had moved into the small spare room at the end of the passage. What had happened to Exomnius? Naturally, that had been Attilius's first question when he arrived in the port. But nobody had had an answer, or, if they had, they weren't about to pass it on to him. His inquiries were met by sullen silence. It seemed that old Exomnius, a Sicilian who had run the Augusta for nearly 20 years, had simply walked out one morning more than 2 weeks ago and had not been heard of since. Ordinarily, the department of the Curator Aquarum in Rome, which administered the aqueducts in regions 1 and 2, Latium and Campania, would have been willing to let matters lie for a while, but given the drought and the strategic importance of the Augusta, and the fact that the Senate had adjourned for its summer recess in the 3rd week of July, and half its members were at their holiday villas around the bay, it had been thought prudent to dispatch an immediate replacement. Attilius had received the summons on the Ides of August, at dusk, just as he was finishing off some routine maintenance work on the Annio Novus. Conducted into the presence of the Curator Aquarum himself, Acilius Aviola, at his official residence on the Palatine Hill, he had been offered the commission. Attilius was bright, energetic, dedicated. The senator knew how to flatter a man when he wanted something. With no wife or children to detain him in Rome, could he leave the next day? And, of course, Attilius had accepted at once, for this was a great opportunity to advance his career. He had said farewell to his family and had caught the daily ferry from Ostia. He had started to write a letter to them. It lay on the nightstand next to the hard wooden bed. He was not very good at letters. Routine information. I have arrived. The journey was good. The weather is hot. Written out in his schoolboy's hand was the best he could manage. It gave no hint of the turmoil he felt within, the pressing sense of responsibility, his fears about the water shortage, the isolation of his position. But they were women. What did they know? And besides, he had been taught to live his life according to the Stoic school, to waste no time on nonsense, to do one's job without whining, to be the same in all circumstances, intense pain, bereavement, illness, and to keep one's lifestyle simple, the camp bed and the cloak. He sat on the edge of the mattress. His household slave, Philo, had put out a jug of water and a basin, some fruit, a loaf, a pitcher of wine, and a slice of hard white cheese. He washed himself carefully, ate all the food, mixed some wine into the water, and drank. Then, too exhausted even to remove his shoes and tunic, he lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, and slipped at once into that hinterland between sleeping and waking that his dead wife endlessly roamed, her voice calling out to him, pleading, urgently, "Aquarius! Aquarius!" His wife had been just 22 when he watched her body consigned to the flames of her funeral pyre. This woman was younger, 18, perhaps. Still, there was enough of the dream that lingered in his mind, and enough of Sabina about the girl in the yard for his heart to jump. The same darkness of hair, the same whiteness of skin, the same voluptuousness of figure. She was standing beneath his window and shouting up, "Aquarius!" The sound of raised voices had drawn some of the men from the shadows, and by the time he reached the bottom of the stairs, they had formed a gawping half-circle around her. She was wearing a loose white tunica, open wide at the neck and sleeves, a dress to be worn in private, which showed a little more of the milky plumpness of her bare white arms and breasts than a respectable lady would have risked in public. He saw now that she was not alone. A slave attended her, a skinny, trembling, elderly woman whose thin gray hair was half pinned up, half tumbling down her back. She was breathless, gabbling. Something about a pool of red mullet that had died that afternoon in her father's fish ponds, and poison in the water, and a man who was being fed to the eels, and how he must come at once. It was hard to catch all her words. He held up his hand to interrupt her, and asked her name. "I am Corelia Ampliata, daughter of Numerius Popidius Ampliatus of the Villa Hortensia." She announced herself impatiently, and, at the mention of her father, Attilius noticed Corax and some of the men exchange looks. "Are you the Aquarius?" Corax said, "The Aquarius isn't here." The engineer waved him away. "I'm in charge of the aqueduct, yes. Then come with me." She began walking toward the gate and seemed surprised when Attilius did not immediately follow. The men were starting to laugh at her now. Musa did an impersonation of her swaying hips, tossing his head grandly. "Oh, Aquarius, come with me!" She turned, with tears of frustration glinting in her eyes. "Corelia Ampliata," said Attilius patiently and not unkindly. "I may not be able to afford to eat red mullet, but I believe them to be sea-water fish, and I have no responsibility for the sea." Corax grinned and pointed. "Do you hear that? She thinks you're Neptune!" There was more laughter. Attilius told them sharply to be quiet. "My father is putting a man to death. The slave was screaming for the Aquarius, that is all I know. You are his only hope. Will you come or not?" "Wait," said Attilius. He nodded toward the older woman, who had her hands pressed to her face and was crying, her head bowed. "Who is this?" "She's his mother." The men were quiet now. "Do you see?" Corelia reached out and touched his arm. "Come," she said quietly. "Please." "Does your father know where you are?" "No." "Don't interfere," said Corax. "That's my advice." And wise advice, thought Attilius, for if a man were to take a hand every time he heard of a slave being cruelly treated, he would have no time to eat or sleep. A seawater pool full of dead mullet, that was nothing to do with him. He looked at Corelia, but then again, if the poor wretch was actually asking for him. Omens, portents, auspices. Vapor that jerked like a fishing line, springs that ran backward into the earth, an Aquarius who vanished into the hot air. On the pastured lower slopes of Mount Vesuvius, shepherds had reported seeing giants. In Herculaneum, according to the men, a woman had given birth to a baby with fins instead of feet. And now an entire pool of red mullet had died in Misenum in the space of a single afternoon, of no apparent cause. A man must make such sense of it as he could. He scratched his ear. "How far away is the villa?" "Please, 100 few paces, no distance at all." She tugged at his arm, and he allowed himself to be pulled along. She was not an easy woman to resist, this Corelia Ampliata. Perhaps he ought at least to walk her back to her family. It was hardly safe for a woman of her age and class to be out in the streets of a naval town. He shouted over his shoulder to Corax to follow. But Corax shrugged. "Don't interfere," he repeated, and then Attilius, almost before he realized what was happening, was out of the gate and into the street, and the others were lost from sight. It was that time of day, an hour or so before dusk, when the people of the Mediterranean began emerging from their houses. Not that the town had lost much of its heat. The stones were like bricks from a kiln. Old women sat beside their porches, fanning themselves, while the men stood at the bars, drinking and talking. Thickly bearded Bessians and Dalmatians, Egyptians with gold rings in their ears, red-headed Germans, olive-skinned Greeks and Cilicians, great muscled Nubians as black as charcoal and with eyes bloodshot by wine. Men from every country of the empire, all of them desperate enough, or ambitious enough, or stupid enough, to be willing to trade 25 years of their lives at the oars in return for Roman citizenship. From somewhere down in the town, near the harbor front, came the piping notes of a water organ. Corelia was mounting the steps quickly, her skirts gathered up in either hand, her slippers soft and soundless on the stone, the slave woman running on ahead. Attilius loped behind them. "A few hundred paces," he muttered to himself. "No distance at all." "Yes, but every foot of the way uphill." His tunic was glued to his back by his sweat. They came at last to level ground, and before them was a long high wall, dun-colored, with an arched gate set into it, surmounted by two wrought-iron dolphins leaping to exchange a kiss. The women hurried through the unguarded entrance, and Attilius, after a glance around, followed, plunging at once from noisy, dusty reality into a silent world of blue that knocked away his breath. Turquoise, lapis lazuli, indigo, sapphire, every jeweled blue that Mother Nature had ever bestowed, rose in layers before him, from crystal shallows, to deep water, to sharp horizon, to sky. The villa itself sprawled below on a series of terraces, its back to the hillside, its face to the bay, built solely for this sublime panorama. Moored to a jetty and a 20-oared luxury cruiser, painted crimson and gold, with a carpeted deck to match. He had little time to register much else, apart from this engulfing blueness, before they were off again. Corellia in front now, leading him down, past statues, fountains, watered lawns, across a mosaic floor inlaid with a design of sea creatures, and out onto a terrace with a swimming pool, also blue, framed in marble, projecting toward the sea. An inflatable ball turned gently against the tiled surround, as if abandoned in mid-game. He was suddenly struck by how deserted the great house seemed, and when Corellia gestured to the balustrade, and he laid his hands cautiously on the stone parapet and leaned over, he saw why. Most of the household was gathered along the seashore. It took a while for his mind to assemble all the elements of the scene. The setting was a fishery, as he had expected, but not much bigger than he had imagined, and old, by the look of it, presumably built in the decadent last years of the Republic, when keeping fish had first become the fashion. A series of concrete walls, extending out from the rocks, enclosing rectangular pools. Dead fish dappled the surface of one. Around the most distant, a group of men was staring at something in the water, an object that one of them was prodding with a boat hook. Attilius had to shield his eyes to make them out, and as he studied them more closely he felt his stomach hollow. It reminded him of the moment of the kill at the amphitheater. The stillness of it, the erotic complicity between crowd and victim. Behind him, the old woman started making a noise, a soft ululation of grief and despair. He took a step backward and turned toward Corellia, shaking his head. He wanted to escape from this place. He longed to return to the decent, simple practicalities of his profession. There was nothing he could do here. But she was in his way, standing very close. "Please," she said. "Help her." Her eyes were blue, bluer even than Sabina's had been. They seemed to collect the blueness of the bay and fire it back at him. He hesitated, set his jaw, then turned and reluctantly looked out to sea again. He forced his gaze down from the horizon, deliberately skirting what was happening at the pool, let it travel back toward the shore, tried to appraise the whole thing with a professional eye. He saw the wooden sluice gates, iron handles to raise them, metal lattices over some of the ponds to keep the fish from escaping. Gangways. Pipes. Pipes. He paused, then swung around again to squint at the hillside. The rising and falling of the waves would wash through metal grills, set into the concrete sides of the fish ponds beneath the surface, to prevent the pens becoming stagnant. That much he knew. But pipes. He cocked his head, beginning to understand. The pipes must carry fresh water down from the land, to mix with the sea water, to make it brackish, as in a lagoon, an artificial lagoon, the perfect conditions for rearing fish, and the most sensitive fish to rear, a delicacy reserved only for the very rich, were red mullet. He said quietly, "Where does the aqueduct connect to the house?" Cornelia shook her head. "I don't know." It would have to be big, he thought. A place this size. He knelt beside the swimming pool, scooped up a palmful of the warm water, tasted it, frowning, swilled it round in his mouth like a connoisseur of wine. It was clean, as far as he could judge, but then again, that might mean nothing. He tried to remember when he had last checked the outflow of the aqueduct. Not since the previous evening, before he went to bed. At what time did the fish die? Cornelia glanced at the slave woman, but she was lost to their world. "I don't know, perhaps 2 hours ago?" 2 hours. He vaulted over the balustrade onto the lower terrace beneath and started to stride toward the shore. Down at the water's edge, the entertainment had not lived up to its promise. But then, nowadays, what did? Ampliatus felt increasingly that he had reached some point, age, was it, or wealth, when the arousal of anticipation was invariably more exquisite than the emptiness of relief. The voice of the victim cries out, the blood spurts, and then... what? Just another death. The best part had been the beginning, the slow preparation, followed by the long period when the slave had merely floated, his face just above the surface, very quiet now, not wanting to attract any attention from what was beneath him, concentrating, treading water, amusing. Even so, time had dragged in the heat, and Ampliatus had started to think that this whole business with eels was overrated, and that Vettius Pollio was not quite as stylish as he had imagined. But no, you could always rely on the aristocracy. Just as he was preparing to abandon the proceedings, the water had begun to twitch, and then, plop, the face had disappeared, like a fisherman's plunging float, only to bob up again for an instant, wearing a look of comical surprise, and then vanish altogether. That expression, in retrospect, had been the climax. After that, it had all become rather boring and uncomfortable to watch in the heat of the sinking afternoon sun. Ampliatus took off his straw hat, fanned his face, looked around at his son. Celsinus at first appeared to be staring straight ahead, but when you looked again, you saw his eyes were closed, which was typical of the boy. He always seemed to be doing what you wanted, but then you realized he was only obeying mechanically. With his body, his attention was elsewhere. Ampliatus gave him a poke in the ribs with his finger, and Celsinus's eyes jerked open. What was in his mind? Some Eastern rubbish, presumably. He blamed himself. When the boy was 6, this was 12 years ago, Ampliatus had built a temple in Pompeii, at his own expense, dedicated to the cult of Isis. As a former slave, he would not have been encouraged to build a temple to Jupiter, best and greatest, or to Mother Venus, or to any of the most sacred guardian deities. But Isis was Egyptian, a goddess suitable for women, hairdressers, actors, perfume makers, and the like. He had presented the building in Celsinus's name, with the aim of getting the boy onto Pompeii's ruling council, and it had worked. But what he had not anticipated was that Celsinus would take it seriously. But he did, and that was what he would be brooding about now, no doubt. About Osiris, the sun god, husband to Isis, who was slain each evening at sundown by his treacherous brother, Set, the bringer of darkness. And how all men, when they die, are judged by the ruler of the kingdom of the dead, and if found worthy are granted eternal life, to rise again in the morning like Horus, heir of Osiris, the avenging new sun, bringer of light. Did Celsinus really believe all this girlish twaddle? Did he really think that his half-eaten slave, for example, might return from his death at sundown to wreak his revenge at dawn? Ampliatus was turning to ask him exactly that when he was distracted by a shout from behind him. There was a stir among the assembled slaves, and Ampliatus shifted further round in his chair. A man whom he did not recognize was striding down the steps from the villa, waving his arm above his head and calling out. The principles of engineering were simple, universal, impersonal. In Rome, in Gaul, in Campania, which was what Attilius liked about them. Even as he ran, he was envisaging what he could not see. The main line of the aqueduct would be up in that hill at the back of the villa, buried a yard beneath the surface, running on an axis north to south, from Baiae down to the Piscina Mirabilis. And whoever had owned the villa when the Aqua Augusta was built, more than a century ago, would almost certainly have run 2 spurs off it. One would disgorge into a big cistern to feed the house, the swimming pool, the garden fountains. If there was contamination on the matrix, it might take as long as a day for it to work through the system, depending on the size of the tank. But the other spur would channel a share of the Augustus's water directly down to the fishery to wash through the various ponds. Any problem with the aqueduct and the impact there would be immediate. Ahead of him, the tableau of the kill was beginning to assume an equally clear shape. The master of the household, Ampliatus, probably, rising in astonishment from his chair, the spectators now with their backs turned to the pool, all eyes on him as he sprinted down the final flight of steps. He ran onto the concrete ramp of the fishery, slowing as he approached Ampliatus, but not stopping. "Pull him out!" he said as he ran past him. Ampliatus, his thin face livid, shouted something at his back, and Attilius turned, still running, trotting backward now, holding up his palms. "Please, just pull him out!" Ampliatus's mouth gaped open, but then, still staring intently at Attilius, he slowly raised his hand. An enigmatic gesture, which nevertheless sets off a chain of activity, as though everyone had been waiting for exactly such a signal. The steward of the household put two fingers to his mouth, and whistled at the slave with the boat hook, and made an upward motion with his hand, at which the slave swung round and flung the end of his pole toward the surface of the eel pond, hooked something, and began to drag it in. Attilius was almost at the pipes. Closer to, they were larger than they had looked from the terrace. Terracotta, a pair, more than a foot in diameter. They emerged from the slope, traversed the ramp together, parted company at the edge of the water, then ran in opposite directions along the side of the fishery. A crude inspection plate was set into each. A loose piece of pipe, 2 feet long, cut crossways, and as he reached them he could see that one had been disturbed and not replaced properly. A chisel lay nearby, as if whoever had been using it had been disturbed. Attilius knelt and jammed the tool into the gap, working it up and down until it had penetrated most of the way, then twisted it, so that the flat edge gave him enough space to fit his fingers underneath the cover and lever it off. He lifted it away and pushed it over, not caring how heavily it fell. His face was directly over the running water, and he smelled it at once. Released from the confined space of the pipe, it was strong enough to make him want to retch. An unmistakable smell of rottenness, of rotten eggs, the breath of Hades, sulfur. The slave was dead. That much was obvious, even from a distance. Attilius, crouching beside the open pipe, saw the remains hauled out of the eel pond and covered with a sack. He saw the audience disperse and begin traipsing back up to the villa, at the same time as the gray-headed slave woman threaded her way between them, heading in the opposite direction, down towards the sea. The others avoided looking at her, left a space around her, as if she had some virulent disease. As she reached the dead man, she flung up her hands to the sky and began rocking silently from side to side. Ampliatus did not notice her. He was walking purposefully toward Attilius. Corellia was behind him, and a young man who looked just like her brother, presumably, and a few others. A couple of the men had knives in their belts. The engineer returned his attention to the water. Was it his imagination, or was the pressure slackening? The smell was certainly much less obvious now that the surface was open to the air. He plunged his hands into the flow, frowning, trying to gauge the strength of it, as it twisted and flexed beneath his fingers, like a muscle, a living thing. Once, when he was a boy, he had seen an elephant killed at the games, hunted down by archers and by spearmen dressed in leopard skins. But what he remembered chiefly was not the hunt, but rather the way the elephant's trainer, who had presumably accompanied the great beast from Africa, had crouched at its ear as it lay dying in the dust, whispering to it. That was how he felt now. The aqueduct, the immense Aqua Augusta, seemed to be dying in his hands. A voice said, "You are my property." He looked up to find Ampliatus staring down at him. The villa's owner was in his middle 50s, short but broad-shouldered and powerful. "My property," Ampliatus replied. "Your property, yes, but the Emperor's water." Attilius stood, wiping his hands on his tunic. The waste of so much precious liquid, in the middle of a drought, to pamper a rich man's flesh, made him angry. "You need to close the sluices to the aqueduct. There's sulfur in the matrix, and red mullets abominate all impurities. That," he emphasized the word, "is what killed your precious fish." Ampliatus tilted his head back slightly, sniffing the insult. He had a fine, rather handsome face. His eyes were the same shade of blue as his daughter's. "And who are you exactly?" "Marcus Attilius, Aquarius of the Aqua Augusta." "Attilius?" The millionaire frowned. "What happened to Exomnius?" "I wish I knew." "But surely Exomnius is still the Aquarius." "No, as I said, I am now the Aquarius." The engineer was in no mood to pay his respects. Contemptible, stupid, cruel. On another occasion, perhaps, he would be delighted to pass on his compliments, but for now he did not have the time. "I must get back to Misenum. We have an emergency on the aqueduct." "What sort of emergency? Is it an omen?" "You could say that." He made to go, but Ampliatus moved swiftly to one side, blocking his way. "You insult me," he said, "on my property, in front of my family, and now you try to leave without offering any apology." He brought his face so close to Attilius's that the engineer could see the sweat beading above his thinning hairline. He smelled sweetly of crocus oil, the most expensive unguent. "Who gave you permission to come here?" "If I have in any way offended you," began Attilius, but then he remembered the wretched bundle in its shroud of sacking, and the apology choked in his throat. "Get out of my way." He tried to push his way past, but Ampliatus grabbed his arm and someone drew a knife. Another instant, he realized, a single thrust, and it would all be over. "He came because of me, father. I invited him." "What?" Ampliatus wheeled around on Corelia. What he might have done, whether he would have struck her, Attilius would never know, for at that instant a terrible screaming started. Advancing along the ramp came the gray-headed woman. She had smeared her face, her arms, her dress, with her son's blood, and her hand was pointing straight ahead, the first and last of her bony brown fingers rigidly extended. She was shouting in a language Attilius did not understand, but then he did not need to. A curse is a curse in any tongue, and this one was directed straight at Ampliatus. He let go of Attilius's arm and turned to face her, absorbing the full force of it, with an expression of indifference. And then, as the torrent of words began to slacken, he laughed. There was silence for a moment, then the others began to laugh as well. Attilius glanced at Corelia, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, and gestured with her eyes to the villa. "I shall be all right," she seemed to be saying. "Go." And that was the last that he saw or heard, as he turned his back on the scene and started mounting the path up to the house, 2 steps, 3 steps at a time, running on legs of lead, like a man escaping in a dream.